Plutarch, the rise of Rome. Plutarch was born around CE 45 and died around 120. Was a writer and thinker born into a wealthy, established family of Chaeronea in central Greece. He received the best possible education in rhetoric and philosophy and traveled to Asia Minor and Egypt. Later, a series of visits to Rome and Italy contributed to his fame, and it was said that he had received official recognition by the emperors Trajan and Hadrian. Plutarch rendered conscientious service to his province and city, where he continued to live, as well as holding a priesthood at nearby Delphi. His voluminous surviving writings are broadly divided into the moral works and the lives of outstanding Greek and Roman leaders. You might also know Plutarch's Lives of the Noble Greeks and Lives of the Noble Romans. The former Moralia are a mixture of rhetorical and antiquarian pieces together with technical and moral philosophy, sometimes in dialogue form. The Lives have been influential from the time of the Renaissance onwards. Each entry has an introduction by Geoffrey Tatum, who is professor of classics at Victoria University of Wellington. He is author of the Patrician Tribune, Publius Claudius, and Always I Am Caesar, and A Caesar Reader, as well as numerous articles and chapters on Roman history and culture, as well as Latin literature. Concerning the rise of Rome, this is part 1 of a general introduction, part 1 of 3. Part 1, Man of the World. During the 1st and 2nd centuries of our era, Greece enjoyed a brilliant recrudescence of literary genius that is often described, filching a phrase from the Greek biographer Philostratus, as the second sophistic. Imperial Greece was indeed a time of talented and frequently flamboyant orators, writers, and intellectuals, of whom the unglamorous Plutarch was simply the best. He was born sometime in the mid-40s of the 1st century CE in the Boeotian town of Chaeronea. His family belonged to the local aristocracy, and Plutarch was sufficiently wealthy to study rhetoric and philosophy in Athens, to travel to Alexandria in Egypt, and to visit Italy more than once. Most of his life, however, he spent in his native city. Quote, I live in a small town, and owing to my affection for it, I prefer to remain there, lest it become even smaller. End quote. That comes from Demosthenes. Although his occupations took him beyond Chaeronea, Plutarch became a citizen of Athens and of Delphi, where he held an important priesthood. It was there, nevertheless, that he gave instruction to his own pupils, and mostly his mature years became the author of a vast body of literary work that made him famous in antiquity and influential in the history of European letters. We sort Plutarch's writings into 2 unequal piles. One, the Lives, consists of his biographies, and the other, the Moralia, or moral essays, includes everything else. Plutarch was a prolific writer. The Catalogue of Lamprias, a 4th century list of his works, includes more than 200 titles. Many of these works have been lost, but quite enough of Plutarch survives to make him one of the best represented of all the writers of classical antiquity. Of Plutarchian biography more presently. But no reader of the Lives should overlook the astonishingly variety concerning the body of works subsumed under the heading Moral Essays. Plutarch was an orator, rhetorician, and most importantly a philosopher, and these diverse roles are reflected in his Moralia. Plutarch studied philosophy and remained a committed Platonist for the whole of his life. He was the author of numerous philosophical works, including highly technical specialist treatises, but he also composed more accessible pieces of the kind we might describe as popularizing on such topics as how to tell a friend from a flatterer and advice on marriage. Sometimes Plutarch composed traditional philosophical dialogues. At others, more experimental pieces like the Amatorias, in which, by way of a tale about a widow who abducts a young man she desires to wed, Plutarch analyzes the nature of homosexual and heterosexual love. Equally remarkable is his Table Talk, a lengthy account of learned and graceful conversations on the part of powerful and cultivated Romans and sophisticated Greeks. Plutarch also wrote numerous essays on religion, as well as didactic pieces on literature, including On the Malice of Herodotus a still pertinent contribution to ancient historiography. Antiquarianism, another Plutarchian interest, resulted in his Roman questions and Greek questions. Of a different nature altogether are Plutarch's set speeches, composed largely for the purpose of aesthetic display. These two are bundled into the Moralia. The best specimens on concerning this matter is the Fortune of Rome and the Glory of Athens. The latter, surprisingly or perhaps provocatively, insists that Athens' true glory lay in her military rather than her cultural achievements. The Rise of Rome is concerned with Plutarch's contributions to biography. In this genre as well, he was highly inventive. In addition to several standalone biographies, Plutarch composed two important biographical collections. Sometime during the reign of the Flavians, from CE 69 to 96, he completed his Lives of the Caesars, a series of sequential imperial biographies beginning with Augustus and concluding with Vitellius, whose defeat and death ushered in the Flavian dynasty. Only Galba and Otho subsist. This was a first in imperial biography. No one, so far as we know, had previously recorded the lives of emperors in this way, collapsing history into imperial biography. Suetonius, of course, soon reinvented the genre for himself, and his version proved far more influential, but that reality should not distract us from Plutarch's originality. More significant, and in the fact the masterpiece of all Plutarch's literary efforts, is his parallel Lives of the Greeks and Romans, biographical pairings each of which conjoins the life of an eminent Greek with a famous Roman political figure. Plutarch's lives, like all of his writings, proved very popular. Much of their attraction resided in their style. In Plutarch's day, Greek authors strove to use only the language and mannerisms of the literary world of the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, the period in their view that represented Greek writing at its best. Plutarch shares this archaizing tendency, but he is not bound by it. His undeniably fine Attic prose admits more than occasionally contemporary vocabulary and syntax, the effect of which is a Greek that is always meticulous, respectable, and suitable to its subject, but almost never stodgy. Plutarch delights in metaphor and imaginative imagery, and he entertains his reader with frequent allusions to poetry and philosophy, which only seldom becomes pretentious. He exhibits an impressive narrative flair, his visual descriptions are vivid, his dramatic sense acute, and his capacity for depicting complexities and nuances of character is advanced. And the stories he tells are all superb. The public and private lives of the greatest men of the Greek and Roman past, hallowed figures who made history and about whom Plutarch records, quote, what is noblest and most important to know, end quote. Plutarch died a famous man, and yet we know remarkably little about his actual life and career. In his writings, he often and affectionately mentions his family, especially his wife, Timoxena, herself an author, and the object of her husband's devotion. Plutarch was the father of at least 5 children, 3 of whom died very young, and in his lives he is alert to the pain felt by fathers who suffer such losses. And he is keen, especially in the Moralia, to mention his intercourse with friends, Romans and Greeks alike, with whom he shares common tastes in literary and philosophical discourse. It was an obligation for a man of Plutarch's class to participate in public life. He makes the point himself more than once, but rarely does he divulge much about his own career as a man of affairs. Still in his 20s, he successfully represented Chaeronea in an embassy to the Roman proconsul governing Greece. During the reign of Vespasian, from CE 69 to 79, Plutarch made a visit to Rome, where he impressed the Romans with his philosophical acumen and his curiosity about Roman history. He quizzed the orator Julius Secundus about the emperor Otho, and traveled throughout northern Italy with the distinguished Lucius Mestrius Florus, a friend of the emperor and consul in CE 75. Whether there was a political purpose to his visit upon his ascension, Vespasian had rescinded many of Nero's concessions to the Greek cities of the east, must remain unknown. Nonetheless, it was Mestrius Florus who secured Roman citizenship for Plutarch, a politically as well as a socially important acquisition which Plutarch himself never mentions. Plutarch also received Athenian citizenship, and he was a long-serving priest at Delphi. After his death, the Delphians and the Chaeroneans together erected a statue in his honor. Trajan, we are told, but not by Plutarch, granted him the honorary trappings of a consul, ornamenta consularia, and in his old age he accepted from Hadrian an appointment as imperial procurator in Achaia, a distinction that indicates that he had earlier been enrolled in the equestrian order at Rome. Again, Plutarch says nothing of this, and some scholars are disinclined to believe any of these imperial laurels. Nevertheless, it is clear enough that Plutarch was a man of practical accomplishments who understood the realities of Roman power and personally benefited from it. He certainly enjoyed the acquaintance of many pertinent Romans. In addition to Mestrius Florus, Plutarch mentions grandees like Quintus Junius Aurelianus Rusticus, who was consul in CE 92, and Gaius Minucius Fundinus, who was consul in CE 107. He dedicated several of his compositions, including the parallel lives, to Quintus Senecio, an honored associate of Trajan, who was a distinguished military commander and held the consulship twice in CE 99 and CE 107. There's even good reason to believe that Plutarch could, in communicating with Trajan, denominate the emperor as his friend. This was illustrious company, though in each instance Plutarch represents his Roman associates not as power brokers, but rather as deeply cultured men, thoroughly at home in the world of Greek literature and learning. It is their conspicuous Philhellenism, not political or practical affairs, that unites Plutarch with his Roman friends. Plutarch became an instant and lasting classic, not least because his lives provided and continue to provide a welcome and, for us, an essential window into the past. In late antiquity, he was deemed a consummate scholar, and even the church fathers read him. The survival of so much of his work is itself testimony to his popularity. He was not forgotten in the Middle Ages and regained a wide readership in the Renaissance, though almost exclusively in Latin and later in vernacular translations. His prominence became even more conspicuous in the 16th century, when he was rendered into elegant and lively French. First the Lives in 1559, followed by the Moralia in 1572. Thereafter, Plutarch remained a profound and pervasive influence in French letters. In Thomas North's translation in 1579, Plutarch at last became available in English, and it was North's Plutarch who inspired Shakespeare's plays, such Coriolanus, Julius Caesar, Antony and Cleopatra, and Timon of Athens. Concerning Plutarch and biography, Plutarch's biographies are intended to illuminate the personality and character of each subject, an inquiry that necessitates an exposition of his historical actions within their historical context. But this account is not meant to be a historian's narrative of events. Plutarch insists on this distinction in the prologue to his lives of Alexander and Caesar. From Alexander 1, we have, quote, "My preamble shall consist of nothing more than this one plea. If I do not record all their most celebrated achievements or describe any of them exhaustively, but merely summarize for the most part what they accomplished, I ask my readers not to complain about this, for I am writing biography, not history, and the truth is that the most brilliant exploits often tell us nothing of the virtues and vices of the men who performed them, whereas a chance remark or a joke may reveal far more of a man's character than the mere feat of winning battles in which thousands fall, or of marshalling great armies or laying siege to cities." End quote. Now, it is hardly the case that Plutarchian biography eschews battles or sieges or political contests of great moment, nor does every biography teem with personal details. Nonetheless, it was never Plutarch's purpose to narrate events in their broadest sweep. Indeed, he was separating biography from history writing, and instead everything included in one of his biographies is there in order to help the reader to appreciate its hero's struggle to live a virtuous life, so that the reader too can make progress towards virtue. It is on this basis that Plutarch puts together a subject's life. Quote, "I select from the events of his career what is noblest and most important to know. This is because our encounter with the nobility of the past has the potential for making us better in the present." End quote. So Plutarch scrutinizes his subjects' lives in order to explicate their virtues and their lapses from virtue, inasmuch as few men can sustain perfection over the course of an entire life. This inspection, although exacting, is not harsh. Plutarch likens the literary representation of his heroes to the work of the best portrait painters, who neither conceal nor exaggerate unflattering features. Plutarch does not believe in a single failure or even several failures need vitiate an entire career, and so his moralizing examinations are invariably conducted with a remarkable generosity of spirit. But what did it mean to imitate the virtues of a Plutarchian hero? The figures he wrote about were all of them great men. For example, in Thomas Carlyle's sense of the phrase, valorous men of war and domineering politicians who held the highest positions in their states. In short, men at the top who, if they did not transform history, nonetheless played a major role in shaping it. Now, it is true that the Parallel Lives was dedicated to a man who was both a political grandee and a distinguished military commander, but even Sosius Senecio served Rome as an official of the emperor and not as an independent statesman or general like Marcellus or the elder Cato. And it is obvious that Plutarch's intended audience consisted mostly of men like himself, that is, highly educated Greeks. The contrast between their political social situation and the circumstances of Plutarch's ancient heroes was unmistakable. Plutarch himself emphasizes in his essay titled Advice on Public Life how much the conditions of imperial Greece differ from those of its classical past. In an age when Greek readers or leaders no longer command armies or vanquish tyrannies, there is folly in confusing the present with the past. Quote, we laugh at small children when they try to pull on their father's boots and wear their crowns. But what of leaders in the cities when they foolishly excite the multitude by encouraging them to imitate their ancestors' achievements in spirit and deeds, even though those are all quite impossible under the present circumstances? Their behavior may be laughable, but the consequences they suffer are no laughing matter. There are many other actions of the Greeks of old which one may recall in order to mold the character of the Greeks of today and give them wisdom. At Athens, for example, one might remind them not of their exploits in war, but of their decree of amnesty after the rule of the 30, or how they fined many for their tragedies about the fall of Miletus, or how they put on crowns when Cassander refounded Thebes, but when they learned that at Argos the Argives clubbed to death 15,000 of their fellow citizens, they gave orders that their entire assembly should be purified, or how, during the Harpalus affair, as they were searching all the houses, they passed by the one of the newly wedded bridegroom. Even now one can imitate these things, and in doing so make oneself like one's ancestors. As for Marathon and Plataea, and all such examples as inspire the multitude with pride and fill them with pointless boasting, we should leave them to the rhetoricians. End quote. The modern Greek, Plutarch observes, need no longer exert himself in war, and Roman administration makes it unnecessary as well as unwise to be so assertive in politics as to open the door to faction. Quote, consider the greatest goods which a city can enjoy: peace, freedom, prosperity, a thriving population, and social harmony. As for peace, we have no real need of politicians at the present time, for every war, Greek and barbarian, has vanished. We have as much freedom as the ruling power allows us, and perhaps more than that would not be a good thing. End quote. Public service remains a crucial duty, but it is no longer the same as it was in Greece's grand and glorious past. As for old-style eminence, Plutarch asks, what influence, what glory can be won by a man whose power is easily undone by an edict of a Roman proconsul? End quote. As he makes clear elsewhere, factionalism within a Greek city can attract unwelcome and dangerous Roman attentions. The celebration and appropriation of the past, still important and beneficial, is no longer a simple matter in the imperial age for any Greek engaging in public life. It is perhaps worth observing that it was not only in Greece that there existed this sense of belatedness and discontinuity with the past. The satires of Juvenal and the annals of Tacitus betray the same anxiety. In his Dialogue on Oratory, one of Tacitus's speakers, in explaining the disparity between contemporary orators and the likes of Cicero, observes how, quote, orators of today have obtained all the influence that it would be right for them to be allowed in a state that is settled and peaceable and prosperous, whereas their predecessors, living in times of unrest and unrestraint, seemed to achieve more in those days of complete disorder, lacking the guidance of a single ruler, end quote. It is no accident that this sounds very much like Plutarch, since a Roman senator, no less than any Greek public figure, was, as Plutarch puts it, both ruler and ruled. Tacitus, like Plutarch, was a biographer, and in his Agricola he explores the challenges of preserving republican virtue under imperial restrictions. For all public figures in the empire, their classical heritage was as much a problem as it was a source of pride or inspiration. Even a Roman then could learn something from Plutarch about the true value of the past. This brings us back to the moral purpose of Plutarch's biographies, from which one should learn the right things to imitate, and, quote, in doing so, make oneself like one's ancestors, end quote. This is an explicit theme in Aratus, probably an early biography. There, Plutarch, addressing a youthful Greek audience, invites and implores his readers to emulate this great man of the past. Not that Plutarch and his readers are asked to overthrow tyrants or seize the Acrocornth as Aratus did, but they are urged to match him in moderation and magnanimity. The same kind of ethical imitation is the point of the parallel lives, though there Plutarch's literary design, like his demands on the reader, is more sophisticated. The Parallel Lives is a series of paired biographies in each of which a Greek is matched with a Roman parallel. Plutarch began to compose these lives early in the reign of Trajan, around 98 to 117, and continued, it seems, for the rest of his life. In all, he completed 48 biographies, of which we possess 46. We have unfortunately lost the first pairing, which joined Epaminondas, a life of the philosophically inclined Boeotian, who defeated the Spartans at the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE, and who dominated Greek politics in his day, with Scipio Africanus, probably not a life of the victor at the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE, but rather of Scipio Aemilianus, the Roman who conquered and destroyed Carthage in the year 146 BCE. Each pairing exhibits more or less the same design. There is usually a prologue, sometimes quite elaborate, explaining Plutarch's selection of heroes. For instance, Timoleon is paired with Aemilius Paulus because the influence of fortune was so deeply implicated in the career of both, whereas in the case of Marcellus and his match, Pelopidas, each was a valiant general ultimately undone by his recklessness. After the prologue comes the biography of the Greek subject, then the Roman, though this order is occasionally reversed. At the end, Plutarch supplies a comparison of the two heroes in which he sorts out their comparative strengths and their failings, and sometimes coming to an explicit conclusion about which was the better man, at others leaving it to his readers to make their own determination. Within each life one finds, despite modest variation, a fairly uniform pattern. Plutarch usually begins by introducing his subject's family, after which he observes conspicuous features of his personality and physical appearance. A description of his early education or its absence routinely follows. After these preliminaries, the subject's career is the focus, reviewed largely through, not entirely in chronological order or sequence. This narrative is punctuated by relevant digressions or clusters of telling anecdotes, which also help to mark out important phases in the hero's life. The circumstances of his death are described when they are known, and this event typically elicits a commentary on the hero's legacy, sometimes through noticing how deeply he was missed, sometimes by way of an observation on the fate of his enemies. It is important to recognize in each of Plutarch's pairings an organic literary unity. Plutarch does not simply compose two discrete lives, which he fits together by means of a prologue and suffixed comparison. Instead, lives are made parallel by means of common themes and issues that permeate and consequently integrate the two biographies within each pairing. For instance, a Greek hero portrayed throughout as a champion of Greek freedom is honored in that role at a festival, an event that must be read over against other proclamations of Greeks' freedom during the Isthmian Games, the moment in which the Roman becomes the liberator of Greece. Each episode is independently a milestone for its protagonist, but together they raise important and unsimple questions about the nature of Greek freedom and its dependence both on Greek character and Roman power, and these issues recur throughout the pairing. The finely textured parallelism in each pairing is there in order to assist the reader's moral improvement. It was Plutarch's conviction, inspired by his Platonism, that the best way to apprehend virtue is by seeing through superficial differences in its specific manifestations in such a way that one gets at its essential reality. An approach to moral analysis, he explains in his essays, Virtues of Women, quote, "There is no better way to learn the similarity and difference between the virtue of women and the virtue of men than by setting lives beside lives and deeds beside deeds. For the virtues, on account of individual natures, take on certain differences, personal colors, one might say, as they assimilate themselves to the habits, physical temperaments, education, and way of life of the individual. But let us not on this account create many different courages, wisdoms, and justices, provided only that individual dissimilarities do not derive from any of the virtues its proper definition." End quote. By examining the lives of the famous women when they have been set in parallel, the reader of this essay is able to perceive the reality of their shared virtue, and it is a proper understanding of that virtue which is the real point of the exercise. Similarly, in the parallel lives, the true subject of each pairing is, in a sense, the virtue manifested in the careers of different men in different cultural situations. Parallelism thus guides the attentive reader towards moral verity, and this is how the parallel lives is able to make its readers better people. They will never imitate the specific deeds of Camillus or Fabius Maximus, but in the same moral excellence is within their grasp, and because virtue is virtue whatever its particular setting, by behaving justly or moderately or honestly, they can enact the ethical greatness of these political and mostly historical figures. Despite Plutarch's original design in the parallel lives, his biographies are usually published separately instead of in parallel. This stems from practical considerations, since most modern readers of Plutarch's lives, the lives of the noble Greeks and lives of the noble Romans, are interested in a specific period of Greek or Roman history, and this volume conforms to that practice. However, in this collection, his pairing of some of the figures who were contemporaries appears in its entirety, including its closing comparison, as Plutarch originally intended. In the second portion, we will cover the Plutarchian hero and Greek and Roman in the imperial age. In our third reading, we will cover Plutarch's historical research, as well as magistracies, money, and measurements, as well as Roman names in Plutarch's time.